when this youthful John F. Kennedy got elected President of the United States, that was invigorating. But he was larger than life, was alive, was vibrant, full of vigor and energy, a real live human being.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
50 years after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, most Americans say it is the president's death and not his achievements while in office that is his legacy. Without a doubt, President Kennedy's assassination altered the course of the nation, but for many associated with that ill-fated trip to Texas, it forever changed their lives. One such individual is Marist Poll senior website editor and journalist John Sparks. Now, 5 decades later, Sparks reflects on the day, his experiences, and why this anniversary is so significant. John Sparks, in his own words.
Well, on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, about 6:30 in the morning in Fort Worth, Texas, I was boarding a bus at my high school, Fort Worth Eastern Hills, to go down to the Hotel Texas in downtown Fort Worth to play for the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The evening before, actually the afternoon before, Thursday afternoon, we were in class and we got a call over the loudspeaker, all band members report to the band hall. And so as a trumpet player, I reported to the band hall, and our band director, Ronnie Martin, passed out music to Hail to the Chief. We practiced it. I was a trumpet player, and he told us to be at school the next morning at 6:30. We were going downtown to play for President Kennedy. The grand ballroom of the Hotel Texas in those days was a fairly large ballroom, and yet at the same time, not everyone could get a ticket to the breakfast. It was a breakfast that had been put on by the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. And we walk in, and wall-to-wall banquet tables lined up with the who's who in Fort Worth, the business leaders, the political leaders, and we had about 69 people in the band, and we were put on a very back wall in 2 columns. We were seated to one side of the ballroom, and our band director, he positioned himself on a chair. He stood in a chair and was watching the entranceway through the kitchen area where the president would enter. And so as soon as he got the high sign that the president would enter, we were to break out with Hail to the Chief. Well, we were excited. Back in those days, although there was color television, everyone had black and white. And so the newspapers were black and white, even the news magazines were primarily black and white. And so we were going to see the President of the United States, so we were wondering what would he look like, because all we had seen were black and white pictures in Life magazine or black and white footage on the newscast. And so when he did walk in, what really stood out for me was the fact that, he was in color. He had ruddy cheeks. He was a large man. It looked healthy tan, although I've been told that, and have read that the Addison's disease contributed to that ruddy complexion that he had. But he was larger than life. Remember, I'm a junior in high school, 17 years old, I guess it was, and so everybody looks larger than life. But here was the President of the United States walking in, and we were all watching our band director, following his direction, but in the corner of our eyes, we were watching John Kennedy walk up and across that stage to take his place on the platform. Everybody wanted to see Jackie because at that time, Jackie Kennedy had taken the United States by storm. She was a beautiful woman, a very attractive woman. One of the things, John F. Kennedy succeeded Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower looked like your grandfather. When he came on to speak to the country and address the nation on television, I would look and he looked like my grandfather. He was an older man. And so when this youthful John F. Kennedy got elected President of the United States, That was invigorating, it was exciting. It was an exciting time, it was a time of Camelot. There were as many people in that ballroom that morning that wanted to see Jackie Kennedy as they did the President of the United States, and yours truly included. So after we finished up at the breakfast and after we saw the motorcade pulled out, we reported back to the buses, went back to school. I changed out of the band uniform and went to class. Was in fourth period American history class. And we had a split period lunch where we'd go half of the fourth period history class, then we'd go to the lunchroom, the cafeteria and eat, and we'd come back and finish up the fourth period class. I had 3 lunch shifts, if you will, with students. So during the lunch, the principal broke in on a loudspeaker and said, many of you know that the band played for the president this morning, and I hate to tell you, but there's been a report that there's been a shooting in Dallas, and it may have involved the president of the United States. And with that, he broadcast over the loudspeaker system the radio coverage, and we slowly learned, like the rest of the world, that not only had the president been shot, but indeed had been mortally wounded. The rest of the day, we passed from class to class, stayed in school till 3:40, but we went from class to class and passed in silence. Everyone was just stunned, teachers, students alike, and they just played the coverage over the loudspeaker of the radio coverage. And then, of course, school was out, and we went home, and like the rest of the country, for the next 4 days, we're glued to the television with the coverage of those events that transpired during the next 4 days. Well, I could not believe it. Here was somebody, as I mentioned, who had ruddy cheeks, was alive, was vibrant, full of vigor and energy, a real live human being. And now he was dead. And that was hard to take. It was hard to imagine, to really fathom. I didn't doubt for a minute the reports, but it was really one of the first encounters with death that I had had at that relatively young age. We did what we were asked to do, and knowing that he had been assassinated, I certainly knew that, you know, it was probably of some historical significance, and that I had gotten to be pretty close to an historical event. At the time, a junior in high school, I'm starting to have thoughts about what it is I'm going to do when I graduate from high school. And I was always going to college, but what was I going to do with my life? What was I going to be? And I always loved history. I loved Texas history. I loved United States history. I loved politics. But in those days, the connotation was that if you majored in history in college, about all you do would be either go to law school. My father always wanted me to be a lawyer, or you could teach. And I did not want to teach. I wanted to, if at all possible, to do something that I was interested in. And so I did not know it at the time, but watching the television coverage for the next 4 days, really a seed was planted. I like to say I recognized that I was watching history, and I was watching it through television reports and newspaper reports, and it occurred to me, maybe you enter that field of broadcast journalism and marry that love of history with something other than teaching in a classroom. Eventually, that's what happened. I got a degree, studied journalism and broadcasting, went to work at the ABC affiliate in Dallas, WFAA. And when I went to work there, I discovered some 30+ hours of 2-inch videotape of the coverage of the assassination. The lion's share of the coverage of the assassination was originated from the Dallas-Fort Worth television stations. And so I became the custodian of this footage at the ABC affiliate. And on the 20th anniversary of the assassination, I produced about almost 20 hours of coverage that we ran overnight. Being a network affiliate, not having a lot of space during prime time or daytime, I put together about 20 hours of coverage so that 20 years later people could watch it just as we had watched it in November of 1963. And so I became very familiar with a lot of the aspects of it. And sometimes I joke, many people have heard this 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, how it's a very, very small world. And I found that that was true with me in the Kennedy assassination. I had been at the breakfast, I'd seen the president. Skipping ahead, Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, who was gunned down by Jack Ruby. A friend of mine in school, Patty Grudy, her father was a mortician, and he got a call Sunday afternoon from someone at the FBI who told him to go to Parkland Hospital in Dallas and pick up Oswald's body and put together a funeral for Oswald. And so I knew Mr. Grudy, and all of a sudden, he's got Oswald's body, and so I've got this connection with people I know that if we're dealing with Margarita Oswald and Marina Oswald, and I thought, wow. Then I have an uncle, the late Colonel James McFarland, and Uncle Jim was a career military guy, and he was a full bird colonel, and at the time he was in charge of Arlington National Cemetery. And he got a call from his boss late Friday afternoon, November 22nd, and he was told to find 4 sites at Arlington Cemetery that they wanted to bury the president in Arlington Cemetery. So he picked out 4 sites, one of which was one particular that he thought would be the most appropriate. And the next morning, my uncle is escorting Robert Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, Peter Lawford, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara around Arlington Cemetery, showing them sites for a grave for the late president. And so Uncle Jim had told us stories about Bobby Kennedy, how angry and full of rage he was, and understandably so. His brother had been gunned down the day before. And the 4th site at the cemetery was the one that my uncle really wanted and liked the best. And as it turns out, it was the one that the family liked. He tells a story. He said he looked up at Bobby Kennedy, and he saw Bobby Kennedy look down directly at the Lincoln Memorial. And he paces off about 20 paces so that it's right in line, a little off from the exact site that my uncle picked. And he said, basically, this is where I want it. And so I have an uncle that was involved in the selection of the president's gravesite. I have a good friend whose father was the mortician that not only embalmed Oswald, but conducted his funeral. And then later on, by the way, was involved in the exhumation of the body after all the questions surrounding Oswald came up about, was it really Lee Harvey Oswald's body in that grave? Well, Paul Grudy, by Texas law, was in charge of the exhumation. So I began to find that all of a sudden that there were a lot of connections that I had. Well, as the 40th anniversary approached in 2003, I found myself back in Dallas. I'd been in New York and returned to Dallas and was working at the CBS O&O in Dallas. And as the 40th approached, I was approached by the news director and asked if there was something that I could do as far as some kind of observance of the anniversary. And so I said, sure, I'll come up with something. I decided I'll interview my uncle. I will interview Jim Wright. I will interview the members of the band director, he was still around. We'll tell some personal stories about who was affected by the assassination or who touched history. And in doing so, I found some more connections, by the way. I have a dear friend whose uncle, she told me, she said, well, Uncle Bill, he loaned Kennedy the car that they drove around in Fort Worth. And sure enough, President Kennedy did not use the bubble top limo in Fort Worth. There was a man named Bill Poston who was the uncle of a friend of mine. And Bill Poston was approached by the Secret Service 2 weeks earlier because he had a Lincoln Continental convertible. And the Secret Service said, we'd like to borrow your car to let the president use in Fort Worth. We'll pick him up at Carswell, take him down to the hotel, drive him back to Carswell the next morning. And then when the president gets back to Washington, we'll get him to write you a letter and a thank you and all. So Bill Poston loaned him the car. So you'll see in the footage, you'll see a white Lincoln Continental convertible that is used outside the Hotel Texas on that motorcade. And that was Bill Poston's car. And so I found, I knew his niece. And so there was that connection. So I interviewed Bill Poston. And then another dear friend of mine who was an air traffic controller. And this was a lifelong friend of mine. He was like my brother, but his friend, his father had been down to the hotel and was trying to get President Kennedy after the breakfast to give him an autograph. The Secret Service agent stole the pen from Dick Curvin, and Mr. Curvin was raising Cain about it, and it caught the president's attention. So he turned to Dick Curvin and he said, "Is something the matter?" And he said, "Yeah, your Secret Service man stole my pen." And so the president turns over to the agent and says, "Is that right?" And the agent sheepishly said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, give him his pen back." And so the agent gives Dick Curvin his pen back, and President Kennedy says to him, said, "Is there anything else I could do for you?" And he said, "Well, I'd like your autograph if you don't mind." So they have one of the last autographs given by the president. And so here was another friend of a friend. And then after he departed Love Field, at Love Field, it turns out that the young man named Quinn Matthews, who was a reporter in Dallas, he and I worked together. Quinn was at the arrival at Love Field and saw the president, just like I'd seen the president that morning in Fort Worth. So we both had experiences at an earlier time in life, and we'd become united. So Quinn has his story. And then another very interesting story, I have a friend named Billy Kennedy. No relation to the president, but Billy Kennedy was a junior at North Dallas High School. And because Billy Kennedy was a friend of Dallas Police Chief Jess Curry's nephew, Billy and Chief Curry's nephew go down to Oak Lawn to watch the motorcade go by on its way to downtown Dallas. Well, Billy, because he's with Curry's nephew, it turns out that the motorcade gets stalled. And so because he was with Chief Curry's nephew, Billy gets to go up and shake hands with the president. And Billy didn't know what to say. He said, "Well, my name's Kennedy too." And the president said, "Well, that's a good name to have," or something like that. And then within minutes later, the motorcade picks up and the president's dead, literally 5 minutes later. It's pretty close to history. So I took all these anecdotes and stories of people I know and put them together and put together a special for the CBS affiliate that year. The assassination of President Kennedy was the first test that television news had been given about coverage. National newscasts had been only 15 minutes long. Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley. The assassination of President Kennedy certainly brought about a larger appetite for television news coverage, and it was also utilized in the events that had been taking place, not only with the assassination, but you must remember that this was the space age too. And so those of us that lived through that saw and watched before Neil Armstrong on the moon, but when John Glenn was shot up, Gus Grissom, and watching all those live broadcasts of our space program. Remember, in those days, you did not have 24/7 cable news. You had network affiliates and maybe an independent station in town. You did not have cable. You didn't have satellite coverage. And so when the networks interrupted to tell you of these things, it was fascinating. And television was learning to rise to the challenge and find innovative ways to try and cover these events. And the technology that was being developed, satellite transmission, went a long way toward bringing the events in other parts of the world to us. Vietnam War, the Vietnam War came into our living rooms, albeit 24 or 48 hours after the fact, because it was film shot in the jungles, but it brought us the war into our living rooms. And so we became aware of things like that. Frankly, the civil rights movement, the race riots that took place in our country, they brought it home to us. They made us look as Americans at things that were both good and bad. Made us look at ourselves and reflect on our position in the world, our position at home and how we treated our fellow human beings. It made us more conscious. This is probably going to be the last major anniversary in which people that participated in those events will be around to tell and reflect about what they saw happen 50 years ago. A number of the people that I interviewed 10 years ago at the 40th have died, and this is going to be probably the last time. One of the things that I find interesting is I look back over old footage, especially in a newsroom. There'll be younger people coming around and they're looking at this with a lot of curiosity. Many of them have not seen this footage before, and it's something that they've learned about in a textbook. And so this is really the last opportunity for some of the people that were really there and that saw these things to convey personally their recollections. So I think that is another significant reason that the 50th stands apart from previous anniversaries. I'd like the younger generation to take away a keener interest in the affairs of our country. When I was a junior in high school, the President of the United States would come on the air to speak to the nation, and the world stopped. The world stopped, and we were glued to that television, whether it be President Kennedy talking about the impending crisis in Cuba with the missiles that the Soviets were trying to bring in, or whether it was Dwight Eisenhower talking about Korea. The world stopped because when the president spoke, it was important. The assassination of President John Kennedy certainly changed the world. It ushered us into a new age of technology and enlightenment. But the world today still has its challenges and its problems that will continue to be with us.